So I'm not really sure what I did wrong this past year, but it was apparently bad enough to get the last spot on a presentation and talk about data. So I actually wore my interesting favorite Neil Patrick Harris tie, and I had to avoid Carlos Johnson all day to get up on stage with this thing still on. Ken mentioned and Walter mentioned at the beginning of the session yesterday that really one of the main topics of interest for the state boards that's been recently developing is around the candidate pipeline issues. And really with that in mind, we've had conversations really in and around this particular topic over the past probably 2 or 3 years, but it really did start building to a crescendo, and not really just from the boards of accountancy, but also from the university that we spoke to, review course providers, the AICPA, I know, has a high level of interest in this. And I think as we had these conversations and we've developed some of the data and reporting over the last few years, we've identified a need to really migrate or change, transition how we reported the information, really what types of information we provide. Over the past 2 months, my team and I spent a lot of time putting all these new data elements into really a new format for the candidate performance book. You all have seen it for the last 3, potentially 4 years in a very different format from before. We're really migrating this thing one more time to really help drive or support decisions at the state board level. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll see the value in the way we've reported it. If not, we wasted 2 months of time. So hopefully it does provide some value. So historically, we provided some of the data elements around the unique candidates sitting for the examination. We stepped back, and a lot of this was driven by conversations with the AICPA and some of their interests, but we started looking at a few additional data elements. One of the primary ones really is cohort size. Sure, we had last year 91,384 unique candidates sitting for the examination, but really what does that look like from an entry into that examination process? So what we have in cohort, the 41,065, are individuals who've never sat for the examination before saying, hey, I'm interested, I'm gonna start sitting for the examination. And this provides you a really interesting long-term trend. When you go year over year, the size of the cohort really determines and drives the overall volume expectations from a section count, candidate count for the next 1, 2, 3 years down the road. These next 2 parts really it's a different way of looking at a data element. You guys have heard long-term, around 60% of students who begin the examination process pass all 4 parts of the examination. So those individuals who are sort of leaving that pipeline leave in 2 different ways. They either pass their 4th part, or they say, you know what, I probably can't do this, it's not for me, or I'm changing careers, so I'm gonna drop out of the examination. And stepping back and considering what this dropout means, we said, again, this is conversations with AICPA based on the 18-month window. If a student hasn't sat for an examination in 18 months, we consider them to have dropped out of the examination. And granted, a few of these individuals will step back after 2, 3, 4 years and begin the process again, but by and large, they've sort of quit and gone a different path. So the 25,643 and the 19,071, that represents roughly the 60-40, the 40% or 60% that have been successful on a year-to-year basis. And these are some interesting points, but we'll get in over the next couple slides looking at a little bit more granular detail to understand how the examinations are working to help manage the students through this process. First of all, here's a cohort size change. So when we look at the cohort size, we can make a blanket statement. Last year, 2014, we had a 4% decline in the cohort size relative to 2013. Initial take, when we looked at the number, we assumed that it really impacted each of the jurisdictions very similarly. But when you look closely, jurisdiction by jurisdiction level, you can see some of the jurisdictions, Hawaii, Vermont, Connecticut, New Hampshire, had a notable decline in overall candidate volume versus in Alaska, DC, or Wyoming that saw a larger percentage increase. So it didn't really affect individuals equally. And some of this has to do with candidate migrations, as I think New Hampshire had a pretty significant rule change last year, which drove or encouraged candidates from outside that state or from international locations to select another jurisdiction. And in this case, I think Alaska was a destination a lot of the students chose in that particular instance. This is really an interesting piece for me. We had looked at students who are passing 4 parts of the examination, and we looked at how long does it typically take. And when we look at the information, roughly a student who passes their 4th part of the examination make 6 total attempts to sit for the exam and take roughly 18 months. Well, that doesn't tell you a whole lot. So we stepped back and said, hey, let's take a look at the cohort years. So the CBT started in 2004. There are students that passed the fourth part of the examination last year in 2014 that started in 2004. And you can look at the numbers. 100 started in 2004, 116 of the students that started in 2005. The notable point here, though, is by and large, if you look at the first 5 years, oh, that is the wrong button. If you look at the first 5 years, over 90%, around 92% of the individuals who begin the examination process will pass all four parts within the first 4 to 5 years of beginning that examination process. There are some rather diligent individuals, obviously, who are going to spend a little bit of extra time and really persist through that process, and they're going to get through. But for the most part, that examination is really helping, I believe, or it appears to help identify or filter out the individuals who are not capable. If you look at the dropout, and this is sort of the complementary slide to this one, these are the individuals who are really dropping out of the examination process. And again, this is, I should not have used red. It makes it look like it's a bad thing. This really is a compliment. You don't want 100% of the individuals eventually passing the examination, because then the examination becomes rather pointless. So here's the 19,000, and you can see for the most part, students are determining that they're not able to pass the examination. Large number of students here will sit for the first part of the exam. They may score 50 or 40 on the examination, realize, hey, this is a little bit more than I was anticipating, so they step out of the process. So what we show here is in 2014, a large majority of the dropouts, or majority of the dropouts that happened in 2013, 2014. So these are the individuals, again, that just barely started the process and decided very quickly, hey, this is not for me. You have individuals who are rather persistent. Even in 2004, there were 348 students who started in 2004 that last year finally went into that status that said, you know what, I'm going to sort of give up. After about 8 or 9 years of attempting to pass the examination, they weren't successful, so they sort of pulled out of that process. What do I point at? There we go. So this next step, we actually started doing a lot of work with universities over the last about 2 years, starting with Notre Dame, St. John's, and it's really expanded to a lot of the ACSB accounting accredited schools, and then some of the other schools outside that process. And we started developing reporting and analysis that was beyond just what was our students' pass rate and how did they do in a section, but getting into reporting tools and analysis that help the school manage their curriculum and the program. Are they not spending enough time teaching an auditing course, or we're really failing on the governmental aspect? What's wrong with that? Or why are students struggling with the writing component of BEC? This information really has started to help drive some decisions at the university level from a curriculum development perspective. The problem we had there was they didn't have a comparative metric. They couldn't go back and say, this report that we're providing to them, how does that relate to a jurisdiction performance, state, accrediting body, elements like that. So one of the things that we stepped back and did with the candidate performance book redesign is try to have a very consistent standard report that affected or was usable across a multitude of stakeholders, whether it's the boards of accountancy, AICPA, review course providers, and in this instance, the universities. And that's what some of the development here is related to. So I don't want to get into too much detail here, but this really shows you, instead of just reporting how did a university, state, how did nationally did students perform on audit, BEC, FAR, Reg, we really get into the subcomponents like information systems, financial management, corporate governance, elements like that. The percentages here are not pass rates. These are the percentage of students who receive a comparable or stronger on their score report. So sort of a simpler way, but I think a lot of the individuals that first see this confuse that to be an actual pass rate on the examination. We'll get into that a little bit later. So here's an interesting piece that we put out there. This is really the content area ranking. And I put this up for a couple reasons. The ranking here shows the specific of the 23 content areas, the area that the students or the candidates performed the best in, meaning they had a higher percentage of students getting a comparable or stronger on that element. And you can see most of the BEC elements take the top sections, and then you have the more complex FAR and audit sections really getting the more difficult or the lower overall performance on that examination. And generally, you would expect that. One caveat to this, when we switched to the CBTE back in 2011, we saw a pretty notable shift in testing behavior where students were sitting for FAR at a much higher percentage. So currently, roughly 37% of the students that sit for the examination begin with FAR. And BEC is traditionally, at this point, the last section that they sit for. So if you eventually get to BEC, they've passed all three parts of the examination. So there's a little bit of a selection bias here. So this isn't maybe not the true ranking, but from an all-in perspective, this is really how the sections fall out. This piece is kind of interesting to us because it leads us to look at how different jurisdictions, different universities are really performing across the board. I pull out writing here, and writing's always an interesting one for us because there's a lot of differences based on different groups you look at. When we look at Japanese students, for instance, speaking with the review course providers, they actually teach their review course in Japanese, but the students turn around and sit for the examination in English. So you get to the writing element, and a lot of the Japanese students perform very, very poorly in this particular area, to the tune of around 15 to 20% of their students get comparable or stronger. So we pulled out jurisdictions that do really well, and this is a top, I believe, 14 jurisdictions. The national average is 73% getting a comparable or stronger. So you can imagine there's some jurisdictions, and a lot of it really is driven by English as a second language. Jurisdictions that have a high number of international students really performing a little bit lower on here. And these are the types of things that I think universities like to see when they do sort of comparative metrics, where they're performing relative to other schools that are within their state, within the jurisdiction, within their region. So here, I was going to just speak to this in general, but I put out the draft version of the candidate performance book on everyone's position a couple of hours ago, and I wanted to sort of get this out. This is going to be published over the next couple months, but really give you an understanding of what new elements are available now, and I think really get you all thinking about what value and uses there are for this information. And we're not here saying, hey, the data is telling us anything. I think our perspective at this point is we want to provide information, make it available so it can potentially inform decisions that we make in the future. And a lot of this information is relatively new, but it's pretty interesting stuff. So the top section of the report is really what we consider the basic data elements, basic reports that we provided very historically in a slightly different format. So you'll see on the top left side, you have candidates that we discussed. These are the unique individuals sitting for the examination. Total sections, percent pass rate, average score, average age. These are, again, things that we're very, very familiar with. Breaking it down by exam type and section. The trending that we really put up here, instead of putting the total unique candidates, because that's a little bit more complex, I think, to understand, we really started putting in the cohort. So you can see in 2009, 2010, you saw this large spike relative to or related to the transition to the CBTE. And then a dip, slight increase again. This is really the 4%. It doesn't seem like a lot, but that's a 4% decline year over year. I think indications are 2015 showing a slight uptick year over year, which is really a good thing. And then you get into some of the other elements, the gender, the residence, the cohort, cohort performance. And when you look at the data here, understand this is all 2014 exam data. So when you look at 2012, there were 9,413 students who started in 2012 who were still testing in 2014, and really how those students did. So here, the longer it takes on the examination, really you see the performance starting to decline, as we knew already. But to have real data to show, that's, I think, important and valuable. Then we get into sort of the cohort pass-4 activity on here, which is really interesting. So you've got how many individuals from each cohort year pass all 4 parts of the examination, 14, 13, and 12. And then we get into, this one really winds up being the area that I think universities are very, very interested in, because it really does help drive some communications at the schools, really telling students sit for the examination early. Really, this is how your performance is going to change or moderate if you're not getting out there sitting for the examination. And you can see in this instance the, well, that was loud, 6, 12, 18. So this element really tells you how many sections and candidates sat for a section within 6 months of the first section they attempted. This is within 12 months of the first section they attempted, and 18 months. So really, how expanded is that examination testing process? And you can see as the students get further and further away from that initial section that they sat for, their performance is really declining on that examination. Again, for universities, driving their students to or encouraging them to sit for the examination as soon after graduation as possible. And then here, individuals sitting for 4 parts of the examination, passing all 4 parts, how long does it typically take the individuals? And you can see within 18 months, it represents around 60% of the students who pass all 4 parts are going to do it within 18 months of starting the examination process. The bottom elements we wanted to get into, I should have figured this out by now. It's really in the audit BEC FAR Reg. Again, this is information that we've presented before, how are individuals performing on each of the different elements and areas of the examination, but you get to the very last section. This gets into the overall content areas, and you can see some of the trending here. Again, this is the students sitting for the examination. You'll see year over year, the longer they get away from that initial section or from their cohort date, you see performance dropping for the most part. And you have some areas that drop 20% in that 3 to 4 year period, again, driving conversations around when to sit for the examination. And the color coding I can explain to you, it'll be explained in depth in the new publication, but it really shows of all the 23 content areas and the years that they sat, where really are the highest performing areas. And you can see some of the trends you would expect, taxing the entity, and then some of the areas within FAR and audit are really students are struggling with, especially as they take longer and longer to sit for that examination. So that's the new book. And again, the thing that we're really excited about is every major report, every slice that we put out there for the reports are going to look exactly the same. So there's broad comparative ability between jurisdictions, between states, accrediting bodies. You can tell how SAC schools are doing versus middle states versus WASC. We're going to have some reports that are a little bit more interesting. How does the SEC perform versus the ACC, not just in basketball, but also on the examination. And I'm pretty sure the SEC tops ACC. Sorry, Bob. So this next aspect really is around what the future looks like for information and data. We've spent a lot of time. It's been sort of a hobby of mine, I think, over the last 3 or 4 years, much to the dismay of Ken. I think I spent probably more time than he would like on the data. But there's a lot of interesting information and things, and I think we're starting to see the value in the work and spending some of the resources here. So we started collaborating with a lot of different entities and institutions. Obviously, we've been working with Mike Decker, the AICPA, and the psychometric team over the last few years, getting into some of the details and better understanding what this information means. Very recently, we stepped out and started working with Joanne Fiore and her team, looking at the Bright Lights project and really how we can support elements like the candidate pipeline, diversity in the profession. We also started spending some time with boards of accountancy, with state societies, and looking at sort of the broad pipeline initiative beyond just the examination, but really what does it look like if in the future we were able to tie in the licensing data with the examination data so we can understand what are the characteristics that drive students and individuals into the profession and what are the characteristics that potentially keep them in the profession versus dropping out after 2 or 3 years within accounting and stepping out and maybe going into industry or changing careers. Really to support this, I know my team's been doing a bit of the work, but we really didn't have a lot of direction and guidance on this on our own, but the conversations that we have with the universities, with the boards of accountancy, with AICP, it really drives much of the change that you've seen here, much of the change that we expect to have over the next couple of years. And sort of to that end, we host on an annual basis, and again, we've been doing this for 3 years, this will be our 3rd year, sort of a data summit. This data summit brings together a lot of experts and individuals that are interested. We have the psychometric team, we have Joanne Fiore's team from AICPA, 7 universities, the president of AACSB is attending. We have one of the societies and 3 or 4 state boards that will be at the data summit, and we're going to really start discussing what we can do with this information from a research perspective, supporting that Bright Lights project, and really how to use and drive decisions related to information we can really pull out of this data and information. It's 3:45. Am I just about out of time? So this is.
Don't ask the crowd.
So that's sort of the skinny on information and data. Try to make it as interesting as possible. Again, I know it's not the topic you want at the very end of a two-day seminar, but if there are any questions related to information we presented, I'd be happy to answer it now or speak with you at the gala. No? Awesome. Thank you.